My parents banned me from New Year's Eve because they said I was not good for the atmosphere. I spent the night alone in my dark studio apartment watching the snow fall over the city. At exactly 12:01 a.m., my phone buzzed against the glass table. My brother Julian was panicking on the other end. He asked me what I had done. He said, "Dad just saw the news, and I was a billionaire overnight." The champagne glass in my hand felt suddenly very heavy. I stared at the Forbes headline glowing on my laptop screen. The Aegis algorithm had finally gone public with a valuation that defied every family prediction. For years, Julian had paraded my lines of code as his own genius during elite country club mixers. My mother had patted my cheek and told me to stay in the shadows of the server room. They thought I was a quiet tool they could use until I broke. Now the entire world knew the architect's real name. Julian's voice became a shrill hiss of desperation through the speaker. He demanded that I call the reporters and tell them there was a technical mistake. He claimed the family reputation was worth more than my individual greed. I could hear my father shouting in the background of their mansion. They were realizing that the house of cards was finally collapsing under legal scrutiny. I traced the digital signature on my patent. The power dynamic shifted instantly. I remembered the cold silence of my MI graduation 3 years ago. My parents had skipped the ceremony to attend Julian's charity polo match instead. They sent a card with a $100 bill and a note about practical hobbies. My research was never real work to them until it had a dollar sign attached. I had spent those lonely nights in the lab building a silent defense. I documented every theft and every lie they ever whispered. The resentment had fueled a masterpiece of software. The phone rang again, but I let it vibrate until the screen went dark. My mother sent a text message begging me to think of the Townsend legacy. She mentioned the hospital wing they wanted to fund with Julian's projected earnings. They did not care about the patients or the breakthrough technology I created. They only cared about the social standing that was currently evaporating in the press. I stood up and walked to the window to see the lights. My bank account was now a digital fortress. I checked my email and found a message from my father's personal attorney. He was offering a settlement if I agreed to share the intellectual property rights. It was a pathetic attempt to claw back the control they lost at midnight. I deleted the draft without replying and felt a strange sense of peace. The atmosphere in my apartment was perfectly still and clear for the first time. I realized I did not need their validation to exist. The news cycle was just getting started on the truth. The lawyer's email remained open like a digital wound on my desk. I pulled my coat tight as the radiator hissed in the corner. Outside my window, the city continued to roar with festive life. My phone buzzed with a vibration that felt like a physical threat. Julian was calling back for the 5th time in 10 minutes. I knew his tone would be desperate and sharp. He had never learned how to handle a situation he could not buy. I finally answered the call to hear the sound of breaking glass. Julian was shouting about a board meeting that was scheduled for dawn. The board members were already circling like vultures. He said the investors were already demanding a forensic audit of the patents. I could hear my mother weeping in the background near the grand piano. They were terrified of the public shame more than the financial ruin. I told him that the truth was non-negotiable now. He went silent for a long beat of static. "You are destroying everything your grandfather built," he whispered. I looked at the framed MIT degree hanging on my wall. I reminded him that grandfather valued innovation over the shallow vanity of appearances. Julian claimed that I had signed an agreement that protected the family interests. I laughed because he still did not understand the difference between us. He had focused on the brand, while I had focused on the code. He had no legal standing to stop me. The front door of my building buzzed with an aggressive rhythm. I checked the security camera and saw my father's driver waiting. He held a thick manila envelope against his chest like a shield. My father was sending a messenger because he could not face me. I hit the release button and waited by the heavy wooden door. The hallway of my humble studio smelled of old floor wax and damp winter air. I felt a cold surge of adrenaline in my chest. The driver handed me the envelope with a look of deep regret. He had been with the family for 20 years of secrets. I pulled out a single sheet of paper with the company letterhead. It was a formal notice of a lawsuit filed in a local court. They were alleging that I had stolen proprietary secrets from Julian. It was a bold lie meant to freeze my bank accounts tonight. They were playing a game of high-stakes chicken. I grabbed my laptop and dialed my own legal counsel immediately. James Kirby picked up on the second ring with a grim voice. He told me that he had already seen the filing online. We had expected them to use this desperate tactic to stop me. He said we needed to release the secondary evidence right away. I opened the folder containing the audio recordings of our last meeting. My hand hovered over the send button for a second. This was the moment of no return for my entire family. I clicked the button and watched the progress bar hit completion. The file contained Julian admitting that the Aegis core was my creation. It would turn their lawsuit into a criminal investigation for perjury. I walked back to the window and watched the driver pull away. The snow was falling harder now and covering the city tracks. My phone began to ring with an unknown Boston number. The unknown number flashed on my screen with persistent rhythm. I answered and heard the sharp voice of a journalist. She was from the Boston Globe and wanted a comment. Word of the leaked recording was already spreading across the newsroom. I told her that the documents spoke for themselves tonight. She asked if I was prepared for the fallout of the audit. I hung up before she could ask about my mother. The room felt smaller as the walls closed in. I sat on the edge of my bed and breathed. My objective was simple now, but the path was blocked. I needed to move my servers to a secure location. Julian had access to the family cloud where I kept backups. If he was desperate enough, he would try to wipe them. I grabbed my keys and a portable hard drive from my bag. The air in the hallway was freezing and smelled of old iron. I had to move fast. The elevator groaned as it descended to the lobby level. I saw a dark SUV idling near the front entrance. Two men in suits were watching the door with intent. I realized Julian had sent more than just a driver tonight. They were likely private security meant to intimidate me into silence. I slipped out through the narrow service exit in the back. My boots crunched on the frozen gravel of the alleyway. I kept my head down. I reached the co-working space where my physical servers sat. The building was nearly empty except for a tired night guard. He nodded as I swiped my badge through the reader. The server room hummed with the sound of cooling fans today. I located my rack and began the manual backup process. My hands were shaking as I plugged in the drive. A red light blinked on the panel indicating a remote login attempt. Someone was already inside. I slammed my fingers onto the keyboard to block the user. The intruder was using Julian's admin credentials to delete my files. I watched the directory icons vanish one by one in seconds. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird now. I managed to sever the connection just before the core. Most of the data was safe, but the damage was done. Julian had crossed a line that no brother should ever touch. A text from James Kirby appeared on my watch screen. He said the board had officially suspended Julian pending the investigation. The recording had reached the chairman of the company 10 minutes ago. They were distancing themselves from the fraud to save the stock. I felt a cold sense of relief wash over me. Julian was finally losing his grip on the crown he stole. I packed my drive and prepared to leave the room. Then the lights went out. The sudden darkness was thick and smelled of ozone and dust. I heard the heavy door click shut and lock tight. A soft electronic beep echoed from the keypad in the hall. Someone had overridden the security system from the main building hub. I was trapped inside the server room with my data. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. A shadow moved across the small glass window in the door. My mother was standing there. Eleanor stood behind the reinforced glass with a look of terrifying calm. Her designer coat looked out of place against the industrial gray of the hallway. I pressed my hands against the cold surface and shouted her name. She did not flinch or reach for the keypad to let me out. Instead, she held up her phone to show me a live video. Julian was standing in the family library holding a heavy silver lighter. He looked broken. "You have 5 minutes to delete the secondary drive," she said. Her voice was muffled by the thick pain, but the command was clear. She explained that Julian would burn the original physical research logs if I refused. Those notebooks were the only evidence of my early trials from college. They were the soul of the Aegis project and my primary defense. My mother was willing to commit arson to protect the family name. The air felt thin. I looked at the server rack and then back at her cold eyes. My objective was to save the logs without losing the digital backup. I told her that destroying the house would not stop the truth. She replied that the Townsend legacy was built on surviving scandals at any cost. She was not a mother in this moment, but a desperate brand manager. I realized she had orchestrated every move Julian made. She was the architect of my erasure. I turned back to the console and began typing with frantic speed. I needed to bypass the room lock using the local maintenance port. My fingers flew across the mechanical keys as the cooling fans died down. I found a hidden script I had written for emergencies like this. It was a backdoor into the building's power grid and security hub. I could hear Eleanor tapping her ring against the glass to distract me. She was impatient. The screen flickered green as I gained control of the magnetic lock. I sent a signal to the mansion's smart security system simultaneously. I hoped the alarm would startle Julian before he dropped the flame. Suddenly, the glass door hissed open, and the hallway lights returned to life. Eleanor stepped back with a gasp as I lunged for my bag. I had a narrow window to escape before she called the driver. She looked truly afraid. I pushed past her without saying a word of goodbye tonight. I could hear the mansion's alarm blaring through her phone speaker now. Julian had dropped the lighter, but the sprinklers had already engaged. The research logs were soaked, but they were not ash in the wind. Eleanor grabbed my arm with a grip that felt like a claw. She told me I would never be one of them. I smiled and finally shook her off. I ran toward the stairs and did not look back once. My phone regained its signal as I reached the street-level exit. A notification from the bank appeared on the lock screen instantly. My personal accounts had been frozen by a court order from my father. I had the data, but I had no way to pay for a room. I stood in the cold wind and realized I was truly broke. The billionaire was now penniless. I stood on the icy curb as the wind whipped my face. My net worth was purely theoretical while my pockets were empty. The frozen bank account meant I could not even hail a cab. I clutched the hard drive to my chest like a holy relic. My objective was to find shelter before the private security team circled back. I began walking toward the MIT campus through the slush. The bright city lights felt like a mockery of my current state. A black sedan slowed to a crawl just behind me on the street. I ducked into a narrow alleyway behind a row of brick townhouses. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked for an escape. I found a heavy steel door leading into an old basement. I slipped inside and smelled the scent of wet concrete and oil. The darkness was total until I fumbled for my phone. A single bar of signal flickered on the cracked screen. I called the only person who had ever truly seen my worth. Dr. Martinez answered on the third ring with a sharp voice. I told her I was locked out of my life and money. She said she was already at her lab on the campus. She told me to use the service tunnels near the river. My father's lawyers were likely tracking my phone's location right now. I had to ditch the device to stay invisible. I knew the tracking chip would lead them straight to me. I smashed the phone against a brick and left the pieces in a trash bin. I navigated the steam tunnels using the memory of my student days. The pipes groaned with the weight of the winter heat. I used my old bypass code to enter the restricted wing. I finally reached the lab and saw the doctor waiting. She looked at my disheveled state and handed me a coffee. She had a laptop open to a secure terminal window. A hidden account I had forgotten was still active. This secondary account held the initial seed funding from an old grant. It was not billions, but it was enough to keep moving. I logged in and moved the money to a fresh wallet. My mother had missed this one because it was under my middle name. I felt a surge of cold triumph in the dark room. We began uploading the evidence to an offshore cloud server. The power was shifting back into my hands. "Your father called the university president an hour ago," she whispered. She explained that he was trying to revoke my graduate credentials. They wanted to strip me of my technical authority before the audit. If I was not a doctor, I was just a thief. I looked at the degree on the desk and felt sick. They were willing to rewrite history to save their skin. I knew I had to act even faster. The audit was scheduled to begin at the New York office. I used the hidden grant funds to hire an independent charter service for a flight south. I had to be there in person to testify today. The doctor walked me to the back exit of the building. She squeezed my hand and told me to be brave now. I saw the black sedan waiting at the campus gate. They had found me despite the smashed phone. I sprinted toward a waiting rideshare as the sedan doors flew open. The driver accelerated before the security team could reach the rear bumper. My objective was the private airfield hidden on the city outskirts. I watched the tail lights fade into the thick morning fog. My heart was a frantic drum against my aching ribs now. The hard drive sat heavy and cold inside my jacket pocket. Dr. Martinez had risked everything to get me this far. I could not let her down. The airfield was a desolate stretch of cracked gray asphalt. A small jet idled near a rusted hangar in the wind. The pilot checked my grant ID and gestured toward the stairs. I climbed aboard and felt the pressurized air fill my lungs. Below us, the city became a grid of flickering amber lights. I opened the laptop and began the final decryption of the logs. My father's legal team was already filing a second injunction. They were trying to stop the plane from landing. We touched down in New York just as the sun rose. The skyscraper housing the audit team looked like a glass sphere. I took a deep breath and smoothed my wrinkled suit. A group of reporters stood near the revolving doors of the lobby. They were shouting questions about the Townsend family's sudden stock crash. I ignored them and walked toward the bank of silver elevators. My security badge still worked despite the recent suspension. I hit the button for the top floor. The boardroom was a tomb of walnut wood and leather. Julian sat at the center table looking like a ghost. He had aged 10 years in the span of one night. My father stood by the window with his back to me. The audit committee looked at me with cold and curious eyes. I pulled the hard drive out and placed it down. Julian tried to stand, but his legs seemed to fail him. The lead auditor asked for my opening statement. I simply clicked the drive. A video file began to play on the massive wall screen. It was not a recording of code or technical data. It showed my mother handing Julian my private journals in the library. She was explaining how to scrub my name from the files. The subtext of their conversation was a roadmap of clinical betrayal. The room went silent as her voice echoed through the speakers. My father finally turned around with a look of pure horror. He had not known the full truth. The power in the room shifted toward me in seconds. The lead auditor began taking notes with a silver fountain pen. Julian buried his face in his hands and started to sob. The sound echoed off the cold walnut walls. My father walked toward the table with a slow gait. He reached out to touch the screen, but then stopped. He looked at me and whispered that he was sorry. I did not accept the apology or offer him a hand. The irreversible decision to destroy them was already made. I demanded justice. I am resigning from the board immediately. Julian gasped out. He looked at the auditors and admitted to the fraud. He said our mother had pressured him to save the name. The realization hit the room like a physical blow to the chest. The auditors began discussing criminal referrals for both of them today. My father sat down in a chair and looked at the floor. He was a king without a kingdom or a crown. I felt a strange and cold emptiness. I walked toward the door as the lawyers began their work. My father called out my name, but I did not stop. I had one more task to complete before the night. I needed to ensure the employees were protected from the crash. I had secretly negotiated a bailout with a rival tech firm. They would buy the company and keep the staff in place. It was the only way to save the innocent people. My family would lose everything. The elevator ride down felt like a descent into a new life. I walked out into the cold air of Manhattan alone. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown legal firm. They were representing the board members who wanted to sue me. They claimed my disclosure had violated the core fiduciary duties I held. It was a new complication that could tie me in court. I laughed because they still thought money could scare me. I was ready to fight. I hailed a yellow cab and gave the driver an address. It was a small apartment in Brooklyn I had rented months ago. I needed a place where the Townsend name meant nothing at all. I looked at my reflection in the window and smiled. I was no longer a shadow in the corner of their mansion. I was the architect of their downfall and my own rising. The billionaire overnight was finally going home to sleep. The world was waiting for tomorrow. The Brooklyn apartment was a sanctuary of exposed brick and quiet. I dropped my keys on the wooden table and exhaled. My objective was to finalize the takeover before the board panicked. I opened my laptop to check the early market reactions. The Townsend Industries stock had entered a terminal freefall during my flight. Every major news outlet was dissecting the library video I leaked. The family brand was officially toxic to the global market. I felt a cold surge of finality. I drafted the final terms for the employee protection bailout. My rival, Marcus Thorne, was waiting for my digital signature. He promised to keep the medical research divisions fully intact. This deal would strip my family of their remaining equity. It was a surgical strike against their pride and power. A sudden knock at the door made me go still. I had not given this address to anyone in my life. The shadow under the door remained perfectly motionless. I peered through the small peephole with a bated breath. My mother was standing in the hall looking utterly defeated. She had traded her silk scarves for a plain hoodie. I opened the door and let the cold air enter. She did not ask to come inside the small room. She handed me a leather satchel without saying a word. Her hands were shaking as she pulled the hood lower. The subtext of her silence was a desperate surrender. I opened the satchel and found a stack of bonds. They were the secret offshore reserves my father never knew. She told me to take them and stop the takeover. She claimed the money could buy back the board's loyalty. I looked at the paper wealth and felt only disgust. She still believed that every person had a hidden price. I told her the era of Townsend secrets was over. She looked at me like I was a total stranger. "You are throwing away your own birthright for a grudge," she whispered. I reminded her that my birthright was stolen years ago. I told her the bonds would be turned over today. They would be used to pay the staff's pension funds. Her face paled as she realized I would not budge. She turned to walk away but stopped at the stairs. She told me Julian was at the precinct right now. He was making a full statement to the police. The realization changed the entire power balance of the night. If Julian confessed, the civil lawsuits would become secondary concerns. I closed the door and returned to my computer terminal. I signed the Thorne agreement and hit the send button. The Townsend era was officially a matter for the history books. I felt the weight of my MIT degree finally lighten. My worth was no longer tied to their crumbling mansion. I was finally free of their dark, heavy shadow. I checked the news feeds and saw Julian's blurred face. He was being led into a station by 2 detectives. The headline confirmed he was cooperating with the fraud division. My mother had failed to stop him from breaking down. I wondered if my father would follow his son's lead. The family was imploding in a very public and messy way. I felt a flicker of pity, but it died quickly. They had earned every second of this public shame. A new notification appeared on my screen from a familiar alias. It was Marcus, the lead engineer from my father's old research lab. He claimed Julian had suppressed data on a faulty valve. This was a new complication that changed the entire legal scope. If the products were dangerous, the liability was truly infinite. My heart hammered as I downloaded the hidden internal reports. The scandal was shifting from financial fraud to public safety. I had to alert the medical board immediately. I spent the next 3 hours mapping the technical failures. The data showed that Julian ignored the warnings for profit. People were walking around with ticking bombs in their chests. This was the dark secret my mother tried to hide. I felt a sick chill as I read the memos. My family had not just stolen my code and dreams. They had risked thousands of lives to maintain their status. I reached for the phone to call the federal agents. The line was dead before I could finish the dial. I looked at the router and saw the lights flashing. A message appeared on my screen in a red font. It was a remote kill switch activated from the company's administrative console, likely on my mother's orders. They were trying to wipe my drive one last time. I scrambled to pull the hard drive from the port. The apartment door was kicked open with a loud crash. 2 men in tactical gear stepped into the room. The men did not fire their weapons in the small room. They moved with a professional silence that chilled my blood. My objective was the external drive containing the valve defect reports. I rolled behind the brick kitchen island as they advanced. One man reached for my laptop while the other scanned the shadows. I gripped a heavy cast iron skillet with white knuckles. They were not here to kill me yet. They were here to erase the final evidence of my family's crimes. A flash, bang, grenade skittered across the floor toward my feet. I squeezed my eyes shut just before the world turned white. The roar deafened me and the air tasted like burnt magnesium. I felt a hand grab my collar and haul me upward. I swung the skillet blindly into the glare of the light. It connected with a sickening thud against a tactical helmet. I scrambled toward the fire escape as my vision began to slowly clear. The city air felt freezing. I reached the rusted metal platform and looked down at Brooklyn. A third man was climbing the ladder from the street level. I was trapped between the roof and the concrete below. I realized these were not Julian's thugs or my mother's drivers. They wore the insignia of the Townsend Industries' primary insurance carrier. The firm was protecting its multi-trillion-dollar liability by burying the truth. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold hard drive. My phone suddenly chirped with a loud emergency alert. The alert was not for a storm or a missing child. It was a remote broadcast from the Federal Health Department. They were issuing an immediate recall on the Townsend cardiac valves. The whistleblower had not just messaged me, he had gone to the top. The men in my apartment froze as their headsets crackled with orders. The insurance company could no longer hide a global headline. I saw the men retreat back through the shattered door. The hunt was over for now. They scrambled out, likely fearing the federal agents who would be arriving within minutes. I climbed down to the street and walked toward the sirens. Federal agents were already swarming the block to secure my testimony. I handed the hard drive to a woman in a dark suit. She promised that the patients would get the help they needed. I looked at the morning sun hitting the Manhattan skyline. The Billionaire overnight was now a witness to a historic collapse. I felt the weight of the lie finally dissolve. I was no longer a Townsend by choice or blood. I sat in the back of the government car and closed my eyes. My father's face appeared in my mind, but I pushed it away. He was a coward who traded lives for an atmosphere of peace. I had built my own world out of truth and code. The legacy was dead, but the people were finally safe. I watched the city move on as we drove away. My phone buzzed with a new message from Julian. He was begging for a lawyer from his prison cell. I didn't reply.